Hello and welcome to Westferry Times. I'm Emily Carter, and thanks for joining us today.
Great to be here.
We're diving into something really important today. UK climate and environmental law. You hear all the talk about being a global leader,
Mhm.
but we want to look at whether the actual legislation stacks up. Is the UK really walking the walk?
It's a crucial question. We'll be looking at the big targets, yes, but also the nitty-gritty frameworks. Are they actually working? That's what we want to unpack for you.
Exactly. And helping us navigate all this, I'm thrilled to have Dr. Oliver Grant back with us. Dr. Grant is a senior policy advisor at the Center for Environmental Law and Policy, and he's also consulted for DEFRA. Thanks so much for being here.
It's my pleasure. Always good to talk about these vital issues.
Okay, let's jump right in then. For anyone just tuning in, what's the absolute baseline? What are the UK's main climate promises, legally speaking?
Well, the big one, the absolute cornerstone, is the net zero by 2050 target. And crucially, that's not just an aim. It's legally binding under the Climate Change Act 2008. That was amended back in 2019 to really cement that 2050 goal.
Net zero by 2050, you hear it everywhere. But that's quite far off. What about sooner? Are there, like, milestones?
Yes, absolutely. You have to think of it like steps on a ladder.
Yeah.
The Climate Change Committee advises on these, and the government sets them as legally binding interim targets.
Okay.
So we're talking a 68% cut in emissions by 2030, and then 78% by 2035. That's all compared to 1990 levels.
And these have legal force.
They do. They aren't just nice ideas. The government is legally required to have policies in place to meet them. So, yeah, the core commitment is pretty ambitious on paper.
That does sound pretty solid. So how are we doing? Are we actually hitting these marks?
It's a bit of a mixed bag, honestly. We've seen some real successes. Coal power is almost gone from the grid, which is huge.
Definitely.
And the UK is genuinely a world leader in offshore wind. That's driven emissions down quite a bit, nearly 50% down since 1990 overall.
Okay, nearly halfway there on the historical reduction. But I sense a but coming. Where are things not going so well?
Right. Here's where it gets trickier. Progress is much slower in some key areas. Insulating homes, for example, making buildings energy efficient, that's lagging. Transport emissions are another big one. That's actually the largest source of emissions now, and it's proving tough to crack.
And agriculture.
And agriculture reforms, yes. Shifting farming practices is complex, politically sensitive too. These areas are definitely proving harder to decarbonize quickly.
Okay, so we have the big targets. Let's talk about the machinery to get there. The Environment Act 2021, why is that considered such a big deal?
Well, it's probably the most significant piece of environmental law we've had in decades. You have to remember, post-Brexit, the UK needed its own framework to replace EU environmental governance.
Right, a domestic rule book.
Exactly. Its main purpose is to set up that new framework and establish some really ambitious long-term environmental targets within UK law.
Okay, so what does it actually do? What are the key parts?
It does quite a few important things. First, like I said, it sets legally binding targets for the long-term, think air quality, biodiversity, water quality, waste reduction.
Okay.
Second, it created a new independent watchdog, the Office for Environmental Protection, the OEP.
The OEP, right.
Their job is basically to hold the government and other public bodies to account on meeting environmental laws and targets. So they have some teeth.
An accountability mechanism. That sounds crucial. What else is in there?
It also brought in this thing called biodiversity net gain for planning decisions. We can maybe talk more about that.
Yes, let's park that for a moment. Anything else major?
And it lays down a framework for tackling storm overflows and sewage pollution. Obviously, that's been a huge public concern recently. So it's trying to cover a lot of ground.
It sounds incredibly comprehensive, very ambitious. But what are the potential roadblocks? Is it all working smoothly?
Well, like any big piece of legislation, the real challenge is always in the implementation and the enforcement. You can have the best law in the world on paper.
But making it happen on the ground.
Exactly. It needs resources, it needs expertise, especially at the local level where councils are often stretched really thin. Political will is key too. So the framework's there, but making it bite effectively is the ongoing challenge.
You mentioned biodiversity net gain. Let's circle back to that. How does that fit into the wider picture of planning and climate?
Okay, so the planning system itself is changing. The National Planning Policy Framework, the NPPF, puts a much stronger emphasis now on climate change.
How so?
Local councils have to make sure their local development plans actually line up with reaching net zero. So they need to think about sustainable transport links, energy-efficient buildings, flood risk, all that stuff.
And biodiversity net gain slots into this.
Yes. It came into force late last year, November 2023. Basically, it means most new developments now have to demonstrate they will leave the natural environment in a measurably better state than it was before.
Measurably better. So not just avoiding harm, but actively improving it.
Precisely. They need to achieve at least a 10% net gain in biodiversity. This could mean creating new habitats like ponds or woods, or restoring existing ones either on the site or nearby.
How's that gone down with developers?
Well, there's been some pushback, definitely. Concerns about costs, complexity, especially maybe for smaller developers.
Yeah.
But there's also a growing sense that it can actually spur innovation in green design, maybe create new markets for habitat creation or offsetting. It's still early days, though.
Okay, let's shift gears to transport. You mentioned it's the biggest emitter now. What's the plan there?
The main strategy is the Transport Decarbonization Plan. And the headline commitment within that was ending the sale of new petrol and diesel cars and vans.
Which is now 2035, right? It got pushed back from 2030.
It did, yes. That caused quite a stir, highlighting that tension between the green goals and, well, perceived economic or practical hurdles.
Understandable. But maybe even more controversial has been the whole low emission zone thing, especially London's ULEZ expansion.
Oh, absolutely. ULEZ has become a real flashpoint, hasn't it? A symbol of this wider debate.
Definitely seeing huge protests. Why such a strong reaction to something aimed at cleaning up the air?
I think, fundamentally, while almost everyone agrees cleaner air is good,
Of course.
the way these policies are implemented raises real questions about fairness. People worry about the cost, especially if they rely on an older vehicle for work or mobility and can't easily afford to switch.
The equity argument.
Exactly. There's a feeling, justified or not, that there hasn't been enough support, financial help, better public transport alternatives to help people make that transition. So it gets framed as a policy that penalizes ordinary people, particularly those less well off. The communication and support package around it arguably could have been handled better.
Right. Moving from the cities to the countryside now. Agriculture, massive land use, significant emissions too. How is policy changing there?
The big change here, again linked to Brexit, is moving away from the EU's Common Agricultural Policy, the CAP, and replacing it with ELMS, the Environmental Land Management Scheme. It's a totally different philosophy.
How so? What's the core idea of ELMS?
Instead of payments being mainly linked to how much land you farm or food you produce, ELMS pays farmers for providing public goods or environmental services.
Environmental services. What does that mean in practice? Planting trees?
That's part of it, yeah. Things like managing land to soak up carbon, improving soil health, creating habitats for wildlife, protecting watercourses, rewilding certain areas, basically rewarding farming practices that benefit the environment.
And this links into things like rewilding and tree planting targets we hear about.
It does. ELMS is the main mechanism intended to deliver on those wider goals for nature recovery and carbon storage on farmland, though those larger rewilding ideas can be quite controversial themselves sometimes.
I can imagine. How are farmers finding this massive shift? Are they on board?
It's variable. You'll find many farmers who are really keen, already doing great environmental work and see the potential. But there are also widespread concerns. Farmers talk about needing much clearer guidance, simpler application processes for the different scheme levels. It can feel quite bureaucratic. And crucially, payments need to be reliable and timely. If the system is too complex or slow, there's a real danger farmers just won't engage, which defeats the whole object.
Okay, let's talk money and business, green finance. What's happening legislatively to make the financial sector greener and hold companies accountable?
The UK has tried to position itself as a leader here. A key move was becoming the first G20 country to make TCFD reporting mandatory for large companies.
TCFD Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures.
That's the one. Basically, big businesses now have to report on the climate risks and opportunities they face, how climate change might impact their bottom line, and what they're doing about it. It forces climate onto the boardroom agenda.
Sounds significant. Is that the main thing, or is there more?
There's more in the pipeline. Wider sustainability disclosure requirements, or SDRs, are being developed. These would cover broader environmental, social, and governance ESG factors, not just climate.
Okay.
And there's work on a UK green taxonomy. Think of it like an official dictionary defining what activities count as green or sustainable.
To stop greenwashing.
That's the main idea, yes.
Huh.
To guide investment towards genuinely sustainable projects and make it harder for companies to just slap a green label on things without substance.
So are these measures actually working? Is finance genuinely getting greener?
We're definitely seeing a shift. There's much more awareness, More green financial products, more pressure from investors. Regulation is driving some of that.
But it's not perfect yet.
No, it's
So
still
yeah.
evolving. Enforcement of these disclosure rules needs to be robust, and some argue it isn't quite there yet. Plus, there's growing pressure now for mandatory transition plans companies having to show how they'll get to net zero and better carbon accounting. It's moving, but there's still a way to go.
We've touched on public reaction to things like ULEZ. Stepping back, what's the general feeling? Is public support for climate action holding up? Is the political will still there?
This is probably one of the trickiest areas right now. Public concern about climate change is still generally high in polls. Most people want action.
But But when specific policies start having perceived costs or clash with other immediate concerns like the cost of living, things get more complicated. Political unity seems more fragile than it was.
Yeah, it feels like that cross-party consensus we had for a while is, well, wobbling a bit.
I think that's fair to say. Climate policy used to be less politically contentious. Now you see more pushback, sometimes framing green policies as elitist or too expensive or damaging to the economy.
Which could be dangerous for long-term goals.
It could. If climate action gets heavily politicized and polarized, like we've seen happen in some other countries, it makes consistent long-term policy much harder to maintain.
So that just transition idea is really important here. Making sure policies are fair. Absolutely crucial. To maintain public support, people need to feel these changes are fair, that the benefits are clear, and the burdens are shared equitably. Transparency and inclusivity in how policies are designed and rolled out are key. Otherwise, you risk alienating people and losing that vital public buy-in.
Looking forward then, wrapping things up, what do you see on the horizon for UK environmental law? What are the next big things likely to come down the track?
I think we can probably expect movement in three main areas. Firstly, more focus on nature restoration, laws giving stronger protections to habitats and species, maybe setting binding targets for improving biodiversity.
Okay, more nature focus. What else?
Secondly, I'd anticipate further evolution of carbon pricing, probably looking at tightening the UK's emissions trading scheme, the ETS making it more expensive to pollute, trying to drive deeper cuts in industry emissions.
And the third area?
The third, and I think this will become increasingly prominent, is climate adaptation.
Adaptation, so dealing with the impacts we can't avoid now.
Exactly. Moving beyond just mitigation cutting emissions to actively preparing for things like more intense floods, heat waves, water shortages. We'll likely see more legislation focused on building resilience in our infrastructure, our homes, our communities. The focus is broadening.
Mitigation and adaptation. That makes a lot of sense. Well, this has been incredibly helpful, a really clear overview of a complex area. It seems the UK has put some ambitious laws on the books, but the real work of delivery and making it fair is ongoing. Thank you so much for sharing your insights.
It's been a pleasure. And yes, I think that sums it up well. The legal frameworks are largely in place, but effective delivery across the board is absolutely paramount now.
And a big thank you to you for tuning into Westferry Times. If you found this deep dive useful, please do consider subscribing or sharing it. It really helps others find the show.
And maybe a final thought from me. Stay engaged with this stuff. The details really matter, and holding policymakers accountable for turning these laws into real-world results is so important for our shared environmental future.
Wise words. Until our next deep dive, stay curious, stay informed, and, well, let's try and stay hopeful.